Sight Reading's Vision 2020 Executive Summit in Prague. I'm here with Scott Bicheno from telecoms.com, who's struggling with a bit of a cold. But hi, Scott, and Adi Kishore from Heavy Reading. Hi, Adi.
Hi.
So we're going to talk a bit about video, which was very much the focus of your presentation yesterday, Adi. And yeah, I mean, you had this interesting point that everybody's now kind of a video player. Everybody's in the video game to some extent. Why do you think that? Why is video becoming such a big deal, and what are the implications, I guess, for telcos?
Sure. I mean, I think the idea of the presentation came out of a conversation I've had with, actually multiple conversations with a couple of operators who don't have a pay TV service. They're not offering any kind of streaming video over the top kind of service either. And so they sort of said, well, you know, we're not really involved with video. Video is not a core service for us. But if you actually look at the composition of traffic on communication service provider networks, video is slowly creeping up to about 80%. So that essentially means that 4 out of 5 bits on every telecommunication network, or at least on the average telecommunications network, will be video within the next few years. And
there's some pretty big implications, aren't there, for how operators tackle it because of that, whether they take a very active role, as some have done like BT in the UK, or try and approach things in a different way, or just stay out of it completely, I guess, which you'd suggested some of them might think about doing.
So I think as part of my presentation, we outlined a couple of different scenarios. So hypothetically, you know, you could do this or you could do that. And the more, certainly if you look at some of the larger, better funded operators, you are seeing a significant investment in content. BT is a good example, spending over 5 billion over the last few years in sports rights, and football rights particularly.
Yeah.
But we're also seeing, you know, mega mergers, Comcast, NBC Universal, ATT Time Warner. We'll sort of see what happens with that, because obviously there are some regulatory challenges or legal challenges that they're going through. But we're also seeing from a number of European operators, Deutsche Telekom, Telefonica, Orange, you know, setting up multi-million, in fact, $100 million funds to aggregate or produce original content.
Yeah.
So they're moving very much in that direction. We're going to integrate content with distribution and kind of package the two together and sort of approach the market that way. Because if you do have 80% of your traffic is video, you might as well find ways to monetize it. And a pay TV service, a streaming video service, at least has a reasonably clearly defined business model.
One thing I want to point out, so you actually flagged up one of Iain's articles in your presentation, and none of mine I noticed, by the way. That hasn't. I won't forget that. But nonetheless, you know, I'm a bigger man than that. I'll move on. But no, joking aside, Iain wrote a piece just questioning the ROI on some of these content investments, specifically BT, wasn't it? And I'm wondering what, you know, if it's possible to track this, or whether you have any thoughts on whether these investments are paying off.
So it depends on how you look at it. I mean, from a pure content play perspective, I'm pretty sure BT's investment is not really paying off. I think for them, a major driver was to try and wrap it up with, to sort of bundle it with their broadband service. So the idea is to help push a multi-play bundle on subscribers and sort of, in a sense, subsidize their content investment. As a pure content play, I think it'd be much harder to justify. You know, part of my presentation yesterday, I talked about how the cost of entry for a lot of these services is very, very high. Content is very, very expensive. If you want high-value content that's going to drive subscriptions and drive viewership, you're going to have to pay some pretty big bills. Netflix is signing off on $7 billion a year. So you want to keep up with them. That's the budget you have to play with.
But it sounds like a pretty dangerous strategy, though, for operators who've got into this game with the big OTT players coming along. I mean, can they really differentiate themselves by having a sort of content strategy where they are spending billions? Because ultimately, if Amazon or Netflix decide they want to get involved, it kind of doesn't seem to augur very well for the telcos.
To be fair, I don't think it's a particularly safe strategy for Netflix itself.
Right.
I think that's a company that's carrying a lot of debt, and its basic sort of business strategy is built on grabbing subscribers. So, you know, they're essentially going to the investors and saying, well, we're growing at this breakneck pace, give us a lot of money so that we can buy a lot of content so that we can keep growing at a breakneck pace. But at some point, that's going to slow down. You know, gravity sort of hits everybody. And so they're going to face some challenges potentially, and they're certainly taking a risk right now. For an operator, you have to, you know, you essentially have at the extreme ends two choices. It doesn't have to be as extreme as I'm going to lay it out, but essentially you can either invest in content and invest in network capacity and keep doing that, and keep holding on to your subscribers and generating revenue. Or you can take the opposite sort of approach and say, look, at some point, I'm going to just put a cap on my capacity. I'm going to say, okay, this is how much bandwidth I'm offering. Take it or leave it, and then you become a value player.
Yeah.
You go in at the lower end of the economic spectrum. You're sort of going in for more value customers, and you compete on price. And then you've got a little more leeway in terms of the kind of content offer that you.
Are there any of them doing that at the moment? Have you seen any evidence of players already doing that?
So it depends on how you. Again, there's, like I said, that's a very stark, very extreme kind of example. But essentially, there are players moving in that direction. So Cable One in the United States is an example of a company that sort of said, right, we're not doing TV anymore. Like TV is just not important to us anymore.
Yeah.
And then in the US is a bit peculiar in that you kind of have to, over-the-air television is very, very limited. So people are getting either OTT or they're getting pay TV services. Whereas if you move to Europe, for example, over-the-air broadcasts are far more common.
Right.
So you've got something like Talk, for example, and even BT that supplements over-the-air reception and services with over-the-top or VOD kind of content. So they've got these hybrid set-top boxes that balance the two.
Yeah.
And in fact, Talk is a good example of a company that's kind of held back on a lot of things, including multi-screen, which they're just about to launch now, and even multi-room. So they don't allow you multiple TV services because of the bandwidth that VOD services would take on their own.
Yeah. We're running a bit short of time, but maybe, perhaps both of you, Scott, you've been writing about this a bit as well, but in terms of the big deal that you mentioned between AT&T and Time Warner, which obviously hasn't gone through yet, but what do you both think about that in terms of there's been a lot of question marks over it, a lot of people saying it makes no sense at all, really, and kind of wondering what your perspectives are on that move.
Well, there's the sort of political aspect of why politicians seem to have got involved in blocking it when it's been a mega deal from the start. Why are they suddenly piping up now?
Yeah.
I'm not sure. And then, the economics of it, I'm not so sure. Though I'll tell you a slight tangent, because at the same time we've got this sort of net neutrality stuff going on in the States. And one thing I hadn't fully appreciated is quite how uncompetitive the cable and the comms environment is in the States compared to, for example, the UK.
Yeah.
I think I saw a stat that 50% of people don't have any choice of supplier in the US, something like that. They're either stuck with Verizon or Comcast or AT&T or whatever.
Yeah.
That might be, you're frowning, you sound like that.
That surprises me because you've got fairly high sort of cable penetration. So you may not have a choice of telco provider, but you will have a fairly sizable cable competitor in most markets.
I saw that come up when someone framing the net neutrality debate because
50% sounds very high.
Yeah. Okay. Well, something like that. Anyway, it's less competitive.
I'd heard as well that in a lot of areas you've only got one or two companies, whereas I suppose in the UK, throughout the whole country, you've generally got sort of 4 or 5 broadband providers, including Virgin.
So while that frames the net neutrality debate, because of course the reason they're repealing that net neutrality thing from the FCC is because they want market forces to intervene. But the counter argument is if there isn't any competition, the market forces can't play. And I'm wondering if that also is a factor in the economics of mega acquisitions like this Time Warner one.
Yeah.
Maybe if you've got a captive market, you can monetize that sort of thing better than if you're having to compete with 3 or 4 other players. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think the two decisions coming sort of close to each other are a little difficult to kind of fully understand. On one hand, there's a pulling back on some of the net neutrality requirements and a greater amount of flexibility for network operators, which is a political and an ideological position, and you can sort of argue it a couple of different ways, and going down into details, there's a whole bunch of moving parts. But that doesn't seem to align then with rejecting the AT&T Time Warner merger.
Yeah, it's not coherent.
It's not a consistent ideology.
Yeah. Well, we'll probably still be talking about it, I imagine, in a few months' time, and possibly even this time next year. But thanks for both for joining me, and yeah.